Welcome to the second session for this event, the History of Scottish Cosmopolitanism at the Fin de Siècle. If you weren't present at the first event, my name is Matthew Kirstie and I'm the lead investigator for the workshop. To my left on my Zoom screen is Michael Shaw, who's the co-I on this project. And we have three panelists who will be talking in this session. The format for this session is I'll ask each panelist to talk for around about 10 minutes or so, and then there'll be 10 minutes after that for questions and answers directed towards individual panelists. Right, so let's get started. So the first of our three panelists today, I want to welcome Charlotte Lauder, who is a PhD student in her second year of studies at University of Strathclyde. Her PhD project is called Press, Print and Nation, Scottish magazine culture, recovering popular Scottish magazine culture from 1870 to the 1920s. It's a project that's funded by the AHRC in collaboration with the National Library of Scotland, so it's very prestigious funding to it. She's going to talk to us today about the Kailyard tradition in Scottish writing at the end of the 19th century and cosmopolitan connections or links within that. I will start speaking and hand over to Charlotte. Over to you.
Thanks, Matthew. Hello, everybody. What I am going to try to do is speak for the least amount of time, so as to hand over to much more eloquent and better scholars, frankly. I think it's funny to start with the person who probably spoke the least about cosmopolitanism in the videos that we prepared for the panel. But obviously that leads to interesting questions, which I'm very much hoping for from you in the audience or people listening and watching. Cosmopolitanism and the Kailyard don't seem to go hand in hand. And honestly, in preparation for this, I haven't convinced myself that they do. There is something paradoxical about the relationship, and it's still something that I'm trying to figure out as to why the Kailyard was so popular in the 1890s at the Fin de Siècle, when we have, as other scholars who are attached to this network have explored, much other different, more interesting, forward-looking cultural and print cultural projects that were going on. I think the best place to start might be at the end of the Kailyard and the critical response to the Kailyard. So most people here might know that in 1901, George Douglas Brown produced The House with the Green Shutters, which is arguably seen as the first anti-Kailyard novel, and it's typically regarded as the most eloquent response to Kailyard literature. And it is, as the Scottish Renaissance and the Scottish modernists who came after George Douglas Brown, as they argued, it was for a bleaker view of Scotland, something that was more accurate, a more realistic depiction of rural life in Scotland. And I suppose, in my opinion, the crux of The House with the Green Shutters is its lack of redemption. So characters don't receive redemption at the end, which is what the Kailyard does offer and does provide. So I mentioned in the video that came out that there were ministerial Kailyarders, so Scottish ministers who were in rural parishes throughout Scotland were writing short stories, fiction in The People's Friend primarily, but then they also went on to publish their own volumes based on those sketches. So actually what I'm going to do is just quickly share screen because I felt influenced by the others. So if I can organize myself, share screen. So this is just a Word document. And this image here is, if everyone can see that, is Alexander Lamond. So Alexander Lamond went by the pseudonym of the Vicar of Deepdale. He was a working class poet, an author, a lecturer, if my current research is following the right direction, and a very well-known contributor to the People's Friend. And interestingly, the pseudonym is the Vicar of Deepdale. So Alexander Lamond did go about, supposedly, in one reference that I've found, in clerical garb. So I'm imagining him going around in a long kind of black cloak, maybe with a vicar's hat, I don't know. And he was operating in Glasgow between the 1870s and then into the 1890s, and he was a frequent reader at the Mitchell Library. So Lamond isn't the most typical person to discuss in regards to the Kailyard, but what he does, and what I'm trying to pursue, is he's pretending to be an English vicar at the same time that he's publishing fiction in the People's Friend, which is very pastoral, which is very Kailyard-esque. We have Scottish ministers pretending not to be Scottish ministers. So religion is what I'm trying to discuss. And I think religion is something that maybe isn't always the most obvious kind of avenue of exploration with regards to the Kailyard. But as I've shown, ministers were really, really intrigued by the Kailyard, and I think wanted to imitate it in a way so as to keep the conversation about religion within secular magazines. So I think that's my argument here, is that people like Lamond pretending to be a vicar, discussing religious themes in the People's Friend, and then other Scottish ministers themselves, such as here, if I just scroll down, such as Fergus Mackenzie, which was the pseudonym of James Anderson, who I mentioned previously. He's the biggest or the most frequent contributor of Kailyard fiction to the People's Friend. There are others as well, so I'm just going to scroll down again. So this is Reverend David C. Stewart, who published under the pseudonym Quintin McCrindle, and he published a novel called Jock, which came out in 1916. And again, that's a Kailyard imitation. So it features Jock, the minister of the parish, I forget the name actually, and it explores similar themes that these other ministers were exploring in their Kailyard fiction. So I'm going to stop sharing. So religion and the Kailyard, that's really what I think is perhaps the most interesting aspect that we can discuss here. And its relationship with cosmopolitanism is complicated, but I think it's one that we can pursue further. The last thing I'm going to discuss just now very quickly is kind of to explain the People's Friend a little bit more. Maybe in the presentation prior, in the video, the People's Friend came across as an entirely provincial, or a magazine that published entirely provincial fiction and predominantly the Kailyard. But this isn't the case. The People's Friend published a variety of metropolitan authors such as Rudyard Kipling, Amy Braddon, Anthony Trollope, and also they published in 1887 a novel by William Sharp. So there was a variety of people who contributed to the People's Friend and whom the People's Friend were happy to publish. So although I do explore the connections between the Kailyard and the People's Friend, there's more to that magazine than meets the eye. And I suppose what's maybe more important in bringing up the People's Friend is why that magazine wanted to publish imitations of the Kailyard, or even just predominantly provincial fiction. And what were they trying to say about Scotland, or how were they trying to present Scottish national identity at that time? And I suppose on the one hand, the Kailyard was immensely popular. And so by including the Kailyard in the periodical or in the magazine like the People's Friend, it will generate sales and hopefully increase revenue. But I think what is more interesting is what it's trying to say about Scotland at the time. And I suppose it's something that I haven't fully fleshed out, but which is being explored in my thesis. And I think what I would like to sort of finish speaking about is that the People's Friend was a magazine about Scotland and seemingly for Scottish people, but its vision of Scotland is one that is quite bounded by geography. So the People's Friend was definitely a magazine for lowland people, maybe people who have exited from areas like Forfarshire or West Lothian or Ayrshire, who have moved from those small towns into bigger cities like Dundee, Glasgow and Edinburgh. who perhaps want to be reminded of the places that they left back home. And I think there is a dialogue between what's happening with these publications, or what's happening in the People's Friend and its publication of lowland fiction, and also what's happening in the Scottish Renaissance in the 1920s, because I think other people have discussed this. I think the Scottish Renaissance in the 1920s is about Scotland that's not based in the lowlands. So it's about Highlandism. It's much more aware of Gaelic culture in Scotland at the time. And I suppose two examples might be Hugh MacDiarmid and Lewis Grassic Gibbon, who kind of shrug off their lowland birth names, Christopher Murray Grieve and James Leslie Mitchell, in favour of much more historically Highland or island area names. And so I think there's something in connection there going on between the lowland fiction that's happening in the 1890s and the sort of much more Highland and Gaelic inspired quote unquote pure Scottish tradition that's happening in the 1920s. Again, I've dodged cosmopolitanism, but hey ho, that's what I'm going to end with. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I mean, you say you dodge cosmopolitanism, but I think you've raised some really interesting points and some really important points. I mean, the premise for this project in part involves, I think, some things that Michael has raised in his work and others about questioning how inward-looking Scotland was in the Fin de Siècle. And there's a kind of, the critics have read the Kayard tradition as suggesting that Scotland was inward-looking. And I think we've heard from Michael and from Conrad and Alex and others at the previous event, suggestions that Scotland was not entirely inward-looking. But I think we need a fuller picture of what Scotland's cosmopolitanism would look like at the Fin de Siècle has to take in the sorts of things that you're talking about. And I'm really interested, the point that interested me most was your sense about Kayard within the People's Friend and the connections there might be between the Kayard and the People's Friend and other more obviously cosmopolitan connections within that magazine. Is that something that you could expand on a little bit at all?
A little bit. Yeah, it is a difficult thing to try and come to terms with, as you say, and partly why we have this network is to try and fully flesh out what we mean by cosmopolitanism, perhaps what we mean by anti-cosmopolitanism. The People's Friend is established in 1869 as a magazine for working class Scots, and a huge amount of the poets, particularly that Kirstie looks at, are published in that magazine. So it is a magazine that centres itself in working class literature and popular literature in the late 19th century. But by the 1880s and the 1890s, the magazine is definitely trying to establish itself as one that can compete with other Victorian popular magazines at the time. And there is a back and forth between at least Dundee and London, because John Lang, who is the proprietor of the People's Friend, establishes a newspaper office on Fleet Street, which actually you can still see today. It's right next to the High Court, and it's this lovely big red brick building that still has on it the painted names of Lang's publications, which were then the Evening Telegraph, the People's Journal, the People's Friend, and the Dundee Advertiser, which is now known as the Dundee Courier. So there is a metropolitan sensibility about the People's Friend by the time we get to the late 19th century through that connection. But it's difficult because at the same time, the People's Friend is trying to maintain its Scottishness. And actually it's being quite kind of, what's the word? Sometimes quite patronising about that, kind of portraying to people, this is the vision of Scotland we'd like you to buy into. and predominantly that is rural, provincial, religiously observant, and often written in vernacular, which are coincidentally the things that people hate about the Killyard. So I think that's why that relationship is there. But again, it's something that I'm trying to research more and more for the purposes of this PhD.
Brilliant, thank you. I think I've got more questions about the People's Friend, but I see that we've got questions from the Q&A. So rather than hog things myself, I'll move to them and maybe come back to things I was going to ask. So we've got a question from my colleague Faye Hamill at University of Glasgow. She asked, do you think as critics we have a tendency to assume that terms like popular and cosmopolitan are mutually exclusive? Could a magazine like The People's Friend actually be making cosmopolitanism popular in some ways?
That's very interesting. Thank you for that, Faye. Gosh, I'd want more time to do a full explanation of that. I think popular is a term that is given to the Killyard, and also is attributed to imitations of the Killyard. So, for example, some of the imitators that I discussed that was in that video are hugely or are very well, very positively reviewed in the Scottish press, not so much in the English press. And I think, as Andrew Nash has explored, the idea of popular being attributed to the Killyard has kind of divided critics. I know that there's disagreements between Beth Dixon, for example, and Andrew Nash about how Margaret Ollivant perceived writers like Annie S. Swan, part of that kind of up-and-coming wave of female novelists who relied heavily on tropes that we associate with the Killyard. And I suppose I don't think that popular and cosmopolitanism are mutually exclusive. To answer very shortly, I think they rely on each other, and again, what I'm coming back to in my head right now is the fact that in the 1890s, I don't have circulation statistics for the People's Friend because the archive does not survive, but at least for the People's Journal, by 1890, that newspaper was selling 1 million copies a week for the whole of 1890. So in those terms, in sales terms, it's popular. And I think, again,
can I ask, is it only sold in Scotland?
No, it's everywhere. Everywhere. And again, there's not a surviving archive for John Lang or for the John Lang Company. But Lang was particularly keen that the People's Friend and the People's Journal be viewed as popular, and to be as popular, as wide a geographical spread as possible as well. So there are, for example, I'm uncovering Irish sketches of Irish life, which are very Killyard-esque, but which are set in Ireland by Irish writers. That's also being published at the same time. So yeah, if that's an answer.
Thank you. So Conrad Glaze has a question from Face type thank you into the chat.
You're welcome.
Conrad says, that was really great, Charlotte. One way to assess the Killyard's cosmopolitan credentials might be to look at how it refers to the world outside the small scale communities written about. Are there any references to either a threatening or an enticing outside in the Killyards? That's actually kind of reference to the
Yeah, there is, Conrad, for sure. And unfortunately, it's a kind of xenophobic, anti-Catholic one. So I'm trying to remember which person wrote this. I believe it's James Anderson in one of his sketches about Cruzy, which is this fictional town that he makes up, similar to the other fictional towns that exist where Killyard exists. And in it, there's a sketch about a minister who has been poached from the small town that he serves to the Presbyterian church in Rome. And there's just lots of references to sort of horrible papists in Rome and lots of villagers saying, oh, please don't leave us for those, you know, heathens, I think is how it's referenced. So that's probably the most obvious, or one of the most memorable examples. The difficulty with the Killyard, and I suppose its relationship with cosmopolitanism, is that there's not much, or there's not many mentions of quote unquote cosmopolitan places. You know, it is a genre or a body of fiction that really locates itself very firmly within the bounds of its parish, or within the bounds of its town or village. And it is one in which it sticks to. So, for example, I haven't found any Killyard sketches which discuss Glasgow even, or Edinburgh, or the sense of otherness that's between rural and urban. But it's one that might be there with a little bit more work.
Thank you. I think Kirsty has a question.
Yes, sorry, Charlotte, I had to run out to deal with a child emergency briefly. So someone may have asked this while I was upstairs, but I wanted to ask you about cosmopolitanism in relation to immigrants and settlers, and again about the international circulation of the People's Friend to those communities. You know, are you cosmopolitan if you're living in Australia and reading the People's Friend and working there? And, you know, is the cosmopolitanism in your paper, I was thinking when I watched the presentation, located in those readers rather than in the paper itself? So it's an implied context because of how popular the People's Friend was with that particular constituency.
I think it's definitely a consideration that could and should be made. So like I say about the People's Friend aiming to be a magazine perhaps for you know, Scottish migrants who've moved from rural to urban locations and who want to remember the places they've been. Again, the same consideration could be made for Scots who have emigrated to New Zealand or to Australia. Both are places that the People's Friend is still popular in. So I should say the People's Friend still publishes 151 years later, and it is still popular in those regions and North America as well. It's difficult because there's not much kind of explicit mentions, even within the People's Friend, of, for example, there's not much correspondence from people who live in the Dominions or the British Empire or these settler areas. So I suppose finding evidence of that is difficult without then traveling to Australia and New Zealand and seeing if there's, you know, free libraries that subscribed to the People's Friend, or finding evidence of newsagents in New Zealand or Australia that had copies of the People's Friend. But I like that theory, that kind of idea that these nations and these places where Scots most prominently resettled in, I like that idea that they're thinking about them when they're there. So possibly.
Oh, I think Fraser has a question.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Charlotte. That was a really fascinating paper. I learned so much. I was really struck by what you were saying about the place of Church of Scotland ministers and authorship, and it sort of occurred to me when I was younger, a very geeky teenager, I used to be quite fascinated in local history, and I grew up in rural Midlothian, and a lot of the documents I was looking at from the 19th century were so-called like statistical accounts that were written by local ministers, and a lot of the history books were written by ministers as well, who'd maybe been based in the parishes for decades. I wonder if writing this sort of Killyard fiction is part of a sort of broader practice of writing, and how those different genres might interact. With these sort of statistical accounts, there seems to be a sort of almost kind of quasi-anthropological urge behind it, and I don't know how that really relates to the Killyard, but I just wondered about the potential other sort of writing that these ministers might be doing, or how that might relate to their sense of vocation, or the appropriate things they're meant to use their time for. Thanks.
Yeah, there is definitely a connection. And I think Andrew Nash very briefly deals with it in one of his opening chapters in his 2007 book about the Kailyard and Scottish literature. And I kind of pushed it a little bit further in a chapter which this idea, this Kailyard exploration has come from, which is that these ministers, who were actually predominantly Free Kirk ministers more than they were established church ministers, they, at the same time as writing these kind of fictional sketches of parishes, were also writing historical and topographical descriptions of the parishes they served. And there is one minister in particular who is called Reverend Peter Anton, who died in 1911, and he is, I would say, between at least 1875 and 1895, maybe later actually, contributes at least a weekly column. I mean, the People's Friend is a weekly, so contributes a column to the People's Friend every week that explores some aspect of local history or biographical history, biography. He describes sort of eminent Englishmen, eminent Scottishmen. So there is definitely a relationship between the fictional and the non-fictional. And I think the sort of more obvious answer is that these ministers were concerned with keeping religion at the forefront of both secular magazines and periodicals, and then also the kind of appropriate reading material that they wanted parishioners to read. So I imagine if you were living in, I don't know, Kerrymuir, you would quite fancy a book about local Kerrymuir history, and you would have that in your house alongside, you know, appropriate secular reading that you would look at on a Sunday or a Saturday night. So there is a relationship there, definitely. So you've reminded me of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
I think Michael has a question. If it's a quick one, so I think we should probably move on. But Michael, do you want to ask a quick question? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. And it's more of just a little comment or a reference, just going off the back of Fraser's point. I don't know if you've read Murdo MacDonald's recent study of Patrick Geddes, but at the beginning of that, he goes into kind of free church ministers as being particularly kind of cosmopolitan minded and having this really broad range of references kind of through generalist education traditions. So just that's a way to maybe help get into that. Another comment I had was with regarding Barry's The Little Minister. And maybe it's a stretch to think about this in terms of cosmopolitanism, but it's interesting that Gavin falls in love with Babi, who's a gypsy, and that kind of nomadism that's being referred to there. And I don't know if there's a way that could link into cosmopolitanism, but certainly we do get this presentation of cultural others, and there is a kind of a romance and a kind of interconnection that develops there. So that's another potential way in, but like you, I think squaring the circle of just how popular and cosmopolitan Kailyard text became in terms of the readership alongside the kind of parochialism of the subject matter itself. It's fascinating, and it's one that we do need to think about in this network. So there are some more questions, I think, in the Q&A, but I think I want to move on now to Kirstie Blair. So to say thank you again to Charlotte. That was fabulous, and you know, despite all the doubts she raised about cosmopolitanism, they seem to be totally apropos. So we're going to move on now to Kirstie Blair. Kirstie Blair is a professor in Victorian literature at the University of Strathclyde. She is very widely published, written several monographs on Victorian poetry. Her more recent work has been on working class poetry, and indeed she published in 2019 a monograph called Working Verse in Victorian Scotland. She's also involved with a number of major AHRC funded projects, one indeed on the People's Friend that we've just been talking about, but also a project called Piston, Pen and Press, recovering Scottish popular magazine culture. Given that Kirstie's here, I should return the favour and give a shout out for Shoddy Court, which is a series of online events that they're running. And if you just Google Piston, Pen and Press, you'll find out more about that. In the interests of transparency, I should also make clear that
having been a very long time fan of Kirstie and her work, I took the rather extreme step of getting married to her just over a decade ago. Yeah, just in the interest of transparency, we spend most of our time talking about our cute children and badly behaved cats, or is it the other way around? This is a rare opportunity for me to hear Kirstie talk and to talk to her about her research. I will stop wittering and hand over to Kirstie.
Thanks, Matthew. Yes, we're coming to you from the hub of Scottish cosmopolitanism today, 2 different floors in our house. Yeah, so I was asked to think about Scottish working class cosmopolitanism, and I especially centre my research on working class poetry for various reasons. In terms of are Scottish working class poets cosmopolitan, and I have at this point probably the distinction of having read more of these poets than anyone else in the world. From investigating this question for this paper, the answer is yes, I think they are, and there's probably quite a lot to do here. However, this is not something that I have been looking for, or that the Piston Pen and Press team have been looking for when we search the archives. So the actual evidence that I have to back that up is relatively slim. And in terms of a second question about, is there something particular going on at the Fin de Siècle in Scottish working class writing in relation to cosmopolitanism? That's a question that I don't have an answer to, because when it comes to the working class poetry, there isn't a massive distinction between what's happening in the 1870s and what's happening right up to the 1920s. You get fairly consistent kind of themes and styles and language and forms, whether in the newspaper columns or in books. But that said, partly due to all the libraries being currently shut, I haven't had a chance to investigate things like perhaps Scottish socialist periodicals at the Fin de Siècle, more kind of left-wing publications, which we might see different forms of political cosmopolitanism coming out and moving into literary cosmopolitanism. Thinking about working class poets, there are major questions of access. And when I watched the other presentations for this session, I was thinking about how the writers I study couldn't have accessed many of the physical spaces that were being discussed, of the Paris Salon or of the club rooms that David Finkelstein showed us in his presentation. But yet they did have access to the literary spaces that have been discussed, because they could read Blackwoods, they could read the Glasgow Herald. Popular newspapers are a huge source for working class writers to find out about what was going on in a cosmopolitan world that they couldn't physically access. They would have read these newspapers, and they would certainly have read periodicals like Blackwoods in their local reading rooms. My PhD student Iona Craig is investigating these reading rooms, and it really is true that every tiny town or village in Scotland and every workplace had its own reading room, and mostly what you read there was you read the newspapers and you read magazines. But where there are also existing library records, because they would have had libraries of various sizes as well, one thing that nobody's done that would be really interesting to do would be to look at the percentage of international literary or historical or philosophical works in those libraries, to see whether you could become a cosmopolitan reader in a tiny reading room located in your small village in Ayrshire or Fife or the Borders or Dumfriesshire or Aberdeenshire. I looked especially, I'm going to share screen now, at 2 particular working class poets, because I knew that they did have cosmopolitan sympathies. Alexander Anderson was the first. This is stretching a point with Fin de Siècle again, because he's really operating in the 60s and 70s, so right up to the 1900s. And Charlotte knows all about Anderson as well, because he became a people's friend poet. That's how he made his career. But I'm very interested in what is said about how he accessed international literature, which is while he was working as a railwayman, and this is a very famous picture of him in Songs of the Rail in his navvy outfit, that he accessed this literature with the aid of Cassell's Popular Educator, linked to John Cassell's kind of publishing empire of popular works for working class readers, which includes, of course, magazines and periodicals as well, and a French grammar. It would be interesting to know where he acquired that. Started off reading Racine and Molière, and then he managed to study German and Italian, and he moved on to Spanish. It's interesting to think about whether Anderson's literary sympathies were something that helped him to be one of very, very few working class writers who actually moved out of manual labour, because he ended up as a librarian at the University of Edinburgh with help from his patrons. And as I talk about in more length in the recorded version of this, I'm interested in the way in which, before he's ever travelled anywhere, before he's seen Europe, before he's done anything other than engage with literature, Anderson imagines himself in these cosmopolitan settings, wandering around Rome. I stride a Roman with a Roman's stride. And as I said in the talk, this makes me wonder about manufactured and invented kinds of cosmopolitanism, and also about how, by constructing yourself as a cosmopolitan working class writer, you actually then become one, because patrons and authorities and newspaper editors and so forth help you to achieve your cosmopolitan dream by actually funding you to travel. And that was how Anderson did get to Rome. I also reminded myself for this paper of one of the most interesting poets that will feature in the Piston Pen and Press project, John Parkinson, an Islamic convert. And you can actually find out quite a lot about Parkinson if you just look him up online. There is, I believe, an academic at Cambridge in the Islamic Studies department who's working on a biography. But the main interest is in him as an Islamic convert, whereas for my purposes, I'm quite interested in him as the spinning foreman at Busby Spinning Mill, and a local Ayrshire poet. This is back in a very different light to Charlotte's comments on religion and religious cosmopolitanism. And I have to say that I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody knows, what led John Parkinson to become so fascinated with Islam, and to become a convert. It seems to be through an interest in astronomy. He writes a lot of astronomical articles, but as yet I've been unable to locate, due to the current situations with libraries and archives, the issues of the Ardrossan and Saltcoats Herald, or the Islamic press that he published a lot of his works in. But he again is very, very interesting in the way in which, prior to becoming one of Britain's leading Islamic writers, he situates himself as a cosmopolitan Muslim writer and simultaneously a deeply local Scottish poet in Lays of Love and War, which was published by Guthrie at the Ardrossan and Saltcoats Herald. So it's a very local publication, and it manages to combine, as here, poems about Scotland's wars with England with poems about Islamic jihad. And to find out exactly why these particular poems are appearing and what is going on in the early 1900s in the wider Islamic world that Parkinson might be responding to, I would love to know about that. I don't yet, maybe somebody else does, because any other time I've seen working class poets writing about Islam, it is not positive. It is generally in relatively negative contexts. And yet all the commentary in the Ardrossan and Saltcoats Herald on Parkinson is very proud of his status as Ayrshire's leading Muslim convert, and simultaneously of his status as an Ayrshire poet, two identities that don't seem contradictory in the discourse about Parkinson, they seem complementary. So I'll end with that because I think it's just a great example of how once you start thinking about working class poets and their cosmopolitan sympathies, everything gets a lot more complicated than it might initially seem. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. So one of the things that struck me when I was listening to Charlotte, and I think connects with what you were saying there, was about the work of Matthew Potowski on decadence. And Potowski points out that if you're a decadent, you tend to think of yourself as you know, aloof and elite, and you don't want to have to do with the hoi polloi. But he, in his book, The Decadent Republic, he comes up with the idea, he draws on Benedict Anderson's idea of the imagined community. And he suggests that in effect, there's a kind of decadent republic that consists of basically a set of adolescent decadents sitting in their bedrooms, all pretending that they're completely individual and alone, but actually united by the fact that they're sharing the same they're reading the same texts, and that they share this self-conception of them. And I wonder if there's a kind of the scope for some of the things that we've just been saying today about a kind of, you know, an imaginary cosmopolitanism, you know, that through Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined community, that you're talking about, you know, ways in which poets situate themselves in relation to places that they've never been. Does that make sense?
That's really, really interesting. I think how that's interesting for me in relation to working class writers is they absolutely have an imagined community of other working class writers, but you're not reading Heinrich Heine, you're not reading Racine and Molière, you're reading Burns in your bedrooms and in the pub together. So if, like Anderson or Parkinson, you sort of go off-piste in your reading and suddenly your sympathies are European or international, you don't have a community because nobody else that you know can read French and German and Spanish. You've actually educated yourself out of being a local provincial working class writer into a group of people that you may want to have contact with, but you may never get to have contact with. I mean, these two writers are, I think, really interesting in the way in which they marshaled, you know, they were self-taught, they taught themselves so that they could physically meet the people they were fantasizing about meeting and travel to the places they fantasized about traveling to. So they actually kind of achieved that dream of cosmopolitanism, but most local writers didn't. They are the exceptions to the rule.
So there's a question from Faye on the Q&A. Just, I mean, back to your point about kind of reading and where people read and how people encounter things and how they might pursue those kind of imaginative connections. She says, Faye says, I'm fascinated by the reading rooms. Do you, or Iona, perhaps she's here, have any insight into the material conditions in the room? Would people visit them because there'd be more light and heat in their homes, as well as reading materials that they didn't have access to?
I don't know if Iona's here.
Can't see Iona on. I'm afraid I don't know Iona.
Coming along. If you want to come to our Shoddy Court discussion next Tuesday, 8 p.m, I'm sure we'll be talking about this. But the answer is, Faye, yes, absolutely. You went to the reading rooms because they were warm and they were comfortable. They were very strongly seen as an alternative to the pub for working men. So you would go there to get out of your house, basically, you know, away from your large family and your children underfoot. Reading rooms didn't just have newspapers and magazines and books. They also had smoking rooms, and billiard tables were a big source of income from them. Iona's been going through all the surviving accounts, which in many cases we've got things like, you know, the accounts and the receipts, but no information about the books. But it's revelatory what Iona's been finding. We knew it was there, but nobody's looked for it. And it really changes your sense of the access that people had to works of literature. I mean, for this talk, I didn't have time to go into it, but I did quickly run through a few lists that I have from things like the Northumberland Miners reading rooms. And I could see that there is a lot of European and international literature there, and that actually, if you wanted to train yourself to be a cosmopolitan person solely via your miner's library in your tiny lead mining village, I think you could have done that. And I don't think it's something that we've really taken into account enough, perhaps. Michael?
No, I think, did Michael have a question, or I saw Fraser lift his hand?
Fraser, you go first.
Thanks, Michael. Kirsty, I thought that was really fascinating. The stuff about Heine I thought was really amazing. I just wondered whether you could say a bit more about that. I was sort of wondering whether I think I'd always sort of assumed that Heine was like reading Burns. So this almost kind of weird sort of pattern of then kind of Heine is sort of partially imitating that kind of tradition and then being translated into Scots. So there's a sort of a kind of level of familiarity somehow there already. But I'd just be really, really interested to learn more about that.
Well, you
maybe I should read your book.
more than I do, because it was only a few weeks ago and I started researching this and I found out that Anderson was interested in Heine, and I thought, what's going on with Heine? I'll run a quick search in the British Newspaper Archive, and then I was like, wow, there's a lot going on with Heinrich Heine. Why is that? And then Michael let me know about the Sharps interest, and then I looked at so there's clearly at least a really fascinating article here about why Scottish working class writers are so interested. Oh, Charlotte,
yeah,
tell me about Heine in the popular magazine press. Charlotte.
I just wanted to say, Kirsty, do you remember or know the poet Henry Dreyer? Who's like
rings a bell.
Yeah, he's in this world of working class literature and poetry. I'm 85% sure that in The People's Friend he used the pseudonym Heine.
Ooh, interesting.
So that's my 2 pence for you.
I'll have to look him up. Yeah, so there is research to be done here. I might go and do it myself, but if anybody else wants to do it, please feel free, because I'm sure you know a lot more about German literature than I do.
I could drop you a line with a few ideas for things to look at, Kirsty. I was just thinking. Yes, I was reading Helen Small's new monograph yesterday, and she actually talks about George Eliot's The Lifted Veil as being a sort of model for cynical cosmopolitanism, and it occurred to me that the character of Latimer in that is a sort of keen reader of Heine and German romantic poetry. So I think the sort of cosmopolitan connection there is so strong.
Yeah, Heine did express some very strong anti-English sentiments as well, though as yet I haven't seen those really being picked up in the Scottish press. I could have probably picked an example who wasn't Heine. It was just when I started looking at him, so many mentions, that I thought it was an interesting way in. If anybody's wondering what I'm talking about, this is in the longer version of my talk. You can see some slides there highlighting this.
Well, Heine is interesting because he's cosmopolitan himself. He spends so much time in France. There's a question from Stefano Evangelista, and then I think we should move on to Fraser. So Stefano says, thank you, Kirsty. I was fascinated by your paper. The question that came to my mind was whether any of your poets experienced migration as part of their working life to the US or British colonies, for example, or if they came in contact with working immigrants to Scotland. Can experiences of migration linked to work rather than leisure help us expand what we understand as cosmopolitanism?
Yes, there are two things here. First, when I was doing this paper, I was thinking about how local Scottish contexts are a lot more cosmopolitan than we think they were because of the presence of migrants in Scotland. And you know, things like Kailyard fiction really, Charlotte can come in if I'm wrong, but they really don't talk about this. But you know, the small Scottish villages, many of them are full of Lithuanian miners, and people from Poland, not to mention all the Irish immigrants. And, you know, they're a lot more international than we think because workers are a lot more mobile than we think. So in terms of Scottish workers going overseas, yes, and actually what's really surprisingly common is you just go and spend a few years in South Africa and you don't like it and you come back. And then a few years later, you decide to try New Zealand. You spend a couple of years living with your brother there. And then you miss Scotland, so you come. So it wasn't unusual to have had a career in which, as an industrial worker, you could have worked in 5 different countries around the world, but still linked yourself throughout that to a small Scottish town and ended up in that small Scottish town. And that's not even thinking about all the people who spent several years as soldiers, for example, which was really common, and all the railway engineers and so forth who took their expertise out from Scotland around the world. That I think is back into what I was asking Charlotte, which is, I don't know how well we think about cosmopolitanism in relation to settler cultures, because those seem to be talked about in Victorian studies in different ways by different people. And it would be interesting to bring them together more and to think more about what happens with those experiences of mobility and migration, and how they feed into people who actually, through all that, continue to refer to themselves as parochial and Scottish a lot of the time.
Thank you. Some really lovely and full answers there. I think we'll move on now to Fraser to the last panelist, and then I hope there might be some time for more general questions at the end. But thank you again, Kirsty. That was wonderful. So if we move on to Fraser Riddell is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Durham, where he's returned recently, I believe, after teaching at Oxford and at St Andrews. He's completing a monograph called Music and the Queer Body in Fin de Siècle literature, and he's going to talk to us about Vernon Lee and her connections with Scotland. Now I'll hand over to you, Fraser. You're still muted at the moment. Oh, Fraser, are you able to unmute?
There we go. Find the button. Sorry about that.
There you go. That's you.
Can you all see my my slideshow? You can. Great. Well, thank you very much, Matthew and Michael, for having me. I feel like a bit of a fraud here because I'm not really an expert in anything Scottish at all, despite my accent. But it's very nice to be asked to participate. This paper is part of a project that is in very early days and is an attempt just to try some ideas out. So I'm very grateful for any comments. I'll say a bit about the broader project from that this relates to on sensing cosmopolitanism, about cosmopolitanism and embodiment in the senses. I'll then give a bit of background on Vernon Lee, who will be a familiar figure to some of you, but less familiar to others. I thought I'd say a bit about Lee's works as it relates to Scotland and Scottish literature. That will be very sort of inexpert, but it might provide ideas for others to go away and develop. I'm then going to look at Lee's 1914 essay on Patrick Geddis's Camera Obscura in Edinburgh, called The Tower of Mirrors. I think it's an interesting piece because it develops some ideas about cosmopolitanism and sensory perception and the relationship between the body and environment. One of the things I'm interested in here is the idea of an ecological cosmopolitan perception. How do we come to sympathize between not just other cultures or a sense of sort of shared cosmopolitan values, but perhaps could we talk about a cosmopolitanism in our relationship with the environment? I think what's striking in this essay is that Lee moves beyond cosmopolitanism in terms of just the geographical or the cultural, but thinking of the cosmopolitan in terms of deep time and a broader sort of ecological perception. I'm sort of interested in thinking about questions about what it might mean to extend our sense of cosmopolitanism but beyond the human, if you like. I'll go on and to think a bit about it in the context of the end of this essay about Lee's broader ideas about the relationship between aesthetic experience and aesthetic and embodied experience. And then finally, I'll turn to consider some of these dialogues, which are sort of asking questions about the ethical commitment of cosmopolitan values. How do we tolerate the behaviors of others that are very different from our own? And one of the things again that I find interesting about these is the way in which they're situated in specific geographical landscapes. In this instance, on the coast of the Firth of Forth in Fife. If I have time, I'll then relate that to some broader questions about appropriate forms of speech and relation, and how when we speak to each other as sort of cosmopolitan citizens, that's always situated in a material world that places particular demands on the body. And I may, if I have time, gesture out to some broader critical and contextual frameworks for the project. I thought I'd launch with a bit about the the project in general with a quote from Nietzsche. This is Human, All Too Human, where he talks about this is this sort of liberated, free spirit who is convulsed, torn loose, torn away, who's motivated by drive and impulse that rules and masters it like a command. A will and desire awakens to go off anywhere at any cost. A vehement, dangerous curiosity for an undiscovered world flames and flickers in all its senses. Nietzsche presents this apparently cosmopolitan desire to travel as a rebellious, arbitrary, volcanically erupting desire for travel, strange places, estrangements, coldness, soberness, frost. It's characteristically extreme in its interest in its combination of sort of somatic bodily experience and the manner in which that sort of underpinning this kind of will to power of self kind of Emersonian self-development, as well as a sort of sense of will to power. And I think it's an interesting reminder that some of the cosmopolitan urges are bound up with slightly more problematic ideas of urges to sort of dominate, as well as just to investigate other cultures in a passive form. I'll come back to some of those issues later, but just to say a bit more about my broader project on sensing cosmopolitanisms. So literature in English at the Fin de Siècle did not just represent new sensory capabilities required to negotiate a globalized world, it also offered a training in them. In a period marked by tensions between nationalist politics and transnational conceptions of identity, literary writers, I'm hoping to show, increasingly sought dialogue with foreign cultural traditions and experimented with hybrid literary forms that transcended linguistic as well as national boundaries. As the conversations we've had in these events has shown, the Fin de Siècle was a historical moment when Enlightenment ideals of cosmopolitanism became the subject of extensive and fraught debate in literary networks. What I'm particularly interested in is how such debates related to new understandings of the senses emerging from experimental psychology and materialist philosophies of mind. So what I'm calling this broader project is a sensing cosmopolitanism, exploring how the senses force writers to grapple with and question universalizing ideals of cosmopolitanism. And I hope to reassess dominant scholarly understandings in Victorian studies of cosmopolitanism by focusing on sensory experience that in a way that probes some of the central conceptual tensions of the field. So the difficulty of positing universal ethical values of world citizenship, the challenges of sustaining affective dispositions equally attuned to the claims of the local and the global, the individual and the collective. I'm thinking about Amanda Anderson's work here and recent work by Regina Gagnier. And also the difficulty of finding aesthetic forms capable of rendering complex networks of capitalism and imperialism. One of the things I hope to argue in the project is that late Victorian writers such as Lee refute claims that sensory perception is natural, given, or universal. And for these writers, I suggest that the demands of a globalized world require attuning one's senses to specific environments as much as cultivating a detached view from nowhere. To address these challenges, I'm interested in the ways that writers experiment with a wide range of genres that really extend far beyond those that have been the attention of work in Victorian studies so far. So I'm thinking of broadly the realist novel and the naturalist assumptions that underpin it. So I'm looking at genres like travel writing, nature writing, supernatural short stories, and sociological essays. And my broader sense is, and I've not yet done all the research to support this, but the senses in this moment become a resource for conceptualizing new Victorian modes of embodied cosmopolitan sociality, expressed in literary forms that transcend the limits of a single language or the boundaries of a nation state. So to say a bit about Vernon Lee, best known, I think, as a figure whose origins lie in aestheticism, a acolyte, if you like, of Walter Pater, who first started writing in the 1880s. Broadly read now for her decadent supernatural short stories, some of which were published in the Yellow Book. There's been a lot of interesting work on Lee's political activism, her pacifism in the First World War, and there's been increasing attention to her work in physiological aesthetics. That's the science, the kind of material science, if you like, of aesthetic response, where Lee's interested in the connection between the body and aesthetic emotion. Pertinent to my broader argument here is Lee's interest across her works in forms of bodily motion in travel and transport. She writes very interestingly about cycling, train travel, motor cars. There's a wonderful description of her cycling around a Romanesque cathedral, I think in Ravenna, and experimenting with different speeds and perceptions to see how it changed her perception of the architecture as she moved around it. She's fascinating with the shifting sense of landscape topography when driving into a motor car, whether it's across northern France or the roads of southern England as they sort of unfold in front of her. Ambivalent about train travel and the motor car, like many writers, in the extent to which it speeds up and apparently obliterates an ability to attend closely to details. She's also fascinated in the way in which these new transport technologies are also new sensory technologies. She's very interested in Zola's depiction of train travel in La Bête Humaine, where, of course, there's a character sees a murder happening in a train carriage as a train is kind of flashing in front of him, and the windows as he looks into the train travel as they sort of move almost are presented like early film. So that's a bit about Lee in general. I thought worth touching base with Lee in Scotland. Miss Brown, Lee's sort of satire on the aesthetic movement and aspects of its sort of misogyny. The main protagonist of that, Annie Brown, is half Scottish. Her father is presented as a sort of alcoholic who unfortunately throws her mother out the window in a fit of violence. But it's an interesting text to think about the presentation of if you like, the sort of Scottish new woman, the precise way in which her body is described as a mix of Celtic, a kind of Celtic racial type and a sort of Italian or kind of Southern European racial type. That's something that we find in her stories, Lady Tal as well, with Atalanta, the protagonist of that story, is also a Scottish woman, a worldly woman in that collection. Vanitas is also interested in the sort of Celtic, the Celtic type as a form of female beauty. I should say, for those of you who don't know Lee, one of the reasons that she's gained a great deal of attention in the last 20 years or so is her significance as a lesbian writer. She writes very interestingly about desire between women, and she had a number of very intense relationships with women across the course of her life, including, I should say, Kit Anstruther Thompson in the bottom the bottom bullet point here, who was from, as her surname might suggest, was from Fife. I'll come on to think about a bit about the dialogues later. Althea, her essays "Beauty and Sanity" is her reflection on the connection between the aesthetic and forms of bodily and moral health, and she wrote that in the shadow of the Eildon Hills, and there's some wonderfully evocative descriptions of Scottish border scenery. Her story, A Worldly Woman, is set in the Scottish borders. Sort of, it's unclear actually whether it's in Northumbria or Scotland. It's set around sort of Yettam, which the last time I checked was in Scotland. But she is describing again, it's a sort of interesting description of a kind of Celtic Celtic racial type. We'll come on to think about some of Lee's travel writings in my discussion of the Tower of Mirrors. There's a very interesting collection available on the Colby College website, which is where Lee's archive is kept, a Vernon Lee notebook, where some of her most interesting travel writing about Scotland, and particularly Fife, is collected in, and that's in sort of typescript. I thought I'd say something very briefly about Lady Archibald Campbell, Janie Sevilla Callender, who was Scottish, although spent much of her life in London. Really interesting figure in the sort of margins of the aesthetic movement. Friends with Wilde. She wrote some interesting treatises about color perception, and was also involved in staging outdoor productions of Shakespeare, including a production of As You Like It, and she was the model for a character in one of Lee's other most important stories called Oak of Oakhurst. So that's a few suggestions for things people might like to look into. I'm conscious that time is ticking on, so let me move on. This is Patrick Geddes and the Camera Obscura. Geddes opened his museum in the Camera Obscura in Edinburgh in 1892. It was described in the American Journal of Sociology in 1899 as the world's first sociological laboratory. And these diagrams are taken from Geddes's 1915 study, Cities and Evolution. The way in which the diagram suggests the hierarchical sort of, if you like, sort of journey, kind of conceptual journey as you move up the stories of the museum, give you some sort of sense of the Lee's interest in perception and different forms of geological and environmental time in the in her essay. So yeah, this is the Tower of Mirrors. I'm just trying to think how much time I have and how much detail I want to go into here. The thing I was most interested about in this extract was the precise way in which Lee characterizes the disorientating sense of visual perception as it unfolds here. It is partly sort of marked in the movement between the past and present tense as we go through this this extract, and the familiarity of the second person that we slip into. You go up the endless corkscrews. It's also quite typical in these interesting language of sort of curdling. The visual perception is given this almost kind of material sense as the image of the sky and the sea unfolds on the mirrors that she's looking into. This is this perhaps bears reading aloud slightly more slowly. And as that jagged line slowly rises like magic fumes upon the disc, there comes to be added something else, dark and shiny patternings below, trembling outlines of roofs and gables and towers silhouetted against the sky, a sort of inside, as it were, of those outlines. It is indeed the inside of a town, roofs looked down upon along their steepness, racks of chimneys and a wide shining gulf across which hurry black spots, which are men and women. Men and women. And the gulf is the great castle terrace, wet with a passing shower, with the whole medieval town like the tail of St. George's slain dragon winding down from it. These streets flicker out of sight, and then stacks of roofs flit slowly by with spires and domes. The sea reappears, headlands and rocks. The town has vanished, and hilltops have slid into view, bare like tops of alpine passes, misty green after the plum colour and orange of tiles and slate. One of the things I was struck by in this essay is the way in which Lee places Edinburgh as a sort of cosmopolitan location by grasping outwards to often surprising comparisons. I don't think describing Edinburgh like the tale of St. George's dragon associated to St. George's with England might be the most obvious metaphor that a Scottish writer would grasp for. And in this extract as well as the next, Lee looks outwards so that Edinburgh is compared with alpine landscapes. Here we have the Castle Rock is like Rhine Rock, compared with Freiburg. The Castle Terrace is like Elsinore, and Holyrood is a Loire Chateau. Again, we have this idea of the sort of pass of the Alps. This reference to a man of science with a poet's soul, I thought was significant, because it seems to combine a sense of the Scottish intellectual history, looking back to the Scottish Enlightenment, but then overlaid with Scottish romantic nationalism, and I'd be interested to hear others' thoughts on that. This issue of this question of deep geological time and the way in which the estrangement of this visual technology allows Lee to sort of feel the emotional force of or realize the sense of the elemental epic of our globe's making, I think is also very significant. We find this comes into focus in the paragraph that follows, where Lee gestures towards the murals of Paul Albert Besnard in the École de Pharmacie in Paris. These have only recently been restored, but they're interesting because they include representations of dinosaurs, plesiosaurs, as well as early sort of caveman sort of figures, as well as woolly mammoths. So Lee is sort of expecting her readers to at least recognize part of that, but also is gesturing to this idea of a sort of an opening out of geological and sort of human sort of non-human kind of spans of time. And what I was particularly interested in is the way in which Lee posits the value of Geddes' tower as providing what she calls the emotions of looking into the immense distances of geological ages. And she says that this is the reason that this tower, if you like, is superior to that of Virgil, whose tower only allows a perspective to look over the whole of the empire, so the whole of the Roman Empire, so that actually the real value of this distorting technology of the visual is the way in which it opens up a cosmopolitan temporal form of perception. I don't think I'll go into this complex question of aesthetic perception that Lee's dealing with, and towards the end of this essay, it's quite abstract, and I think I'm running out of time. But again, this is about the boundaries between body and environment, the sort of co-formation of perception and sort of dynamic interchange between the body of the perceiver and the environment that they're exposed to. And if that sounds terribly abstract, I'm happy to try and unpack a bit more in the discussion that follows. The broader question I'd like to sort of touch on briefly is that to do with a cosmopolitan relationship with landscape, in which certain landscapes might allow for a form of opening up a pause, a sort of ethical sense of distance or reflection that allows and promotes tolerance. In Lee's dialogues in Fife, there are frequent descriptions of the eye as it moves across a landscape, allowing for a pause and otherwise sort of heated discussion, so that debate and that in itself can be sort of abrasive and aggressive, can be kind of reframed, and it's situated in the way in which it's situated in these precise sort of environmental conditions, so that forms of sort of cosmopolitan discussion about ethical values and commitments are themselves sort of situated in specific environments. In this case, this discussion takes place in the East Neuk of Fife. I think I'll round off there and say that this has been an attempt to think about some of the ways in which sort of visual technologies can help us think about different ways in which cosmopolitan behaviors and mindsets are located in specific environments, and to try and raise some broader questions about the relationship between the body and cosmopolitanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fraser. That was fascinating. I think we've just got time for a few specific questions for Fraser, and then maybe a little bit of time for some general questions at the end. If it's okay, I was going to start things off just to kind of see if because I read this story kind of in a hurried way, and it took me. My brain's still trying to get around it. The Tower of the Mirrors, and it was only kind of the second time that I read it that I realised that it was, as you point out, that it's about the camera obscura in Edinburgh. And then I wondered if that's actually kind of, listening to you talk, I wonder if that's actually quite a good or an interesting figure for some of the things that we've been talking about today. So we've been talking about kind of cosmopolitanism as an imaginative phenomenon, something that might occur between people who don't ever get the chance to go abroad. And if you think about what if I've understood it, Lee is describing in the Tower of the Mirrors, it's that sense that you go into this building and then you have sort of instantaneous access to kind of a landscape that's all around. It's a bit like some of those sort of panoramas that you see, which are a very popular kind of display form of exhibition in the 19th century to the 20th century. And I wondered if that's a figure for the cosmopolitan imagination. But I mean, because you've got a tension in the story that you're describing between sort of instant access to a number of places, but also when you enter the building, you have to go through these twisty stairs, and she describes that. And then she kind of enacts that for you as well. She gives you this kind of instant imaginative access to, the local landscape, but also other landscapes, other times, and other authors. Is that what we're looking at here? Do you think it's a figure for the cosmopolitan imagination, or is that just stretching it too much?
No, I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, that if we think of one mode of sort of distance and detachment, if you like, is sort of looking down on people from a great height. And what is interesting here is that the constant movement of these mirrors means that there's a way in which that process is complicated and sort of becomes a sort of alienating one, so that something which at one moment feels as if you're looking at the sky, then you find you're looking at the sea. And that finding these different perspectives to look at look down on a cityscape and a landscape can make you draw cosmopolitan connections, whether that's all these sort of associations with other cities and European landscapes, or it can estrange your relationship with the landscape so that you see it as a function of different temporal logics, revealing sort of deep geological time. That
she must have been aware of I mean, because she explicitly mentions Geddes in the story, doesn't she? She must have been aware of the evergreen. Do you think she's using it as a figure for the evergreen as well? I mean, for Geddes, kind of, you know, his interest is love of architecture and art and literature, and how they kind of combine in the evergreen.
I don't actually know. I defer to Michael at that one. I've not really looked into the relationship between Lee and Geddes, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that was actually my question for you, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm not aware of it either. I didn't know about this essay until you shared it with me a few months ago, and it's just remarkable. But what strikes me about it is the way that she's referring out to this kind of spatial amalgam, but then also this deep time. It's very consistent with Geddes's ideas. So yeah, just when I was reading it, I was thinking, how well did they know each other, and yeah, how much of Geddes had she read? But yeah, I suppose that's a question we're going to have to sort of explore between us and work out.
It's clearly a great topic if we don't know the answer, isn't it? I mean, it's to be done. In the Q&A, Alex Murray from the previous session says, thanks for that, Fraser. How do we feel more broadly about the ethics of a non-human cosmopolitanism? Lee is a terrible snob and has little respect for those working class people and places that she encounters in England, Scotland, and Wales. I knew there was a reason we had you with Kirsty and Charlotte. Lee is the anti-working class, clearly. She prefers landscapes that have been depopulated by the migrations of capitalism. She doesn't want humans to distract from the topographical encounters with landscape. Most cosmopolitanism is about ethical relations to others. Do we let Lee off the ethical hook if we celebrate her non-human cosmopolitanism?
Those are good questions. Yeah, I think no. I mean, I must admit, I've been some of Lee's descriptions of cities and sort of, you know, working class environments are really horrendous. I mean, when she's getting the train through Newcastle, she describes it as a sort of Dantean kind of, the Tyne is a sort of Dantean kind of river of filth. I think I'm sure if I'm at the same time, I've heard other scholars sort of defend Lee along the lines that she well, I mean, Lee worked in the lectured in the working class working men's colleges in London, so she was also involved in working class education. So I think there might be a way of defending her slightly from some of those views. I need to think more about that there are of course problems with evacuating landscapes of the human in a way that faces sort of class differences and the problems of working class, the limitations of working class lives, and I need to think more about that.
Thanks, Fraser. I'm just going to finish up because we're coming to the end of the session. I'm just going to finish up with a question. I don't know if that connects back to this. I've been thinking about the ethics of cosmopolitanism. Just a question from Linda. Linda Hughes from much earlier on in this session, where she thanked Charlotte for her paper and was interested in the questions that Charlotte raised about religion and cosmopolitanism. And she says, you know, on the one hand, cosmopolitanism gives us Annie Besant and Theosophy, or Andrew Lang's treatment of other faiths under the signs of imperialism and anthropology. She mentions Christine Ferguson's recent work on occult magazines. How can, Linda asks, religion in the larger sense be situated in relation to cosmopolitanism? Does becoming religiously observant inhibit cosmopolitanism, or is that an oversimplification, since observation and exploration are not mutually exclusive? So there's Linda bringing in questions of religion, as well as these ethical questions and political questions we've just answered. And if anybody wants to come in on that. Kirsty, did you unmute there?
Yeah, I did unmute myself because I was going to say, doesn't it depend on the religion? I certainly think in relation to Charlotte's paper, there might be a case to be made that Scottish Presbyterianism is defining itself as the anti-cosmopolitan. Is that fair, Charlotte, or not? Or not? You know, there are particular kinds of Scottish Christian practice that define themselves as local, but then, you know, all the Fin de Siècle converts to Roman Catholicism. I don't know how that's playing out in Scotland. Michael probably does. Surely that's leaning in a more cosmopolitan direction, and definitely John Parkinson and Islam, that's leaping away from the parochial and the provincial via your faith and your practice. Charlotte, is that fair?
Yeah, no, I was just going to very, very briefly say, from the kind of work that I've sort of paid to these, or the attention that I've paid to these ministers, I think my opinion would be that what these ministers were trying to do with popularising the Kailyard and writing in these penny magazines about or imitating Kailyard fiction was to kind of establish Free Kirk Presbyterianism as the Presbyterianism of Scotland. And there's a really fantastic paper that came out in May this year by Ryan Mallon, which explores how Free Kirk leaders and some of the followers of the disruption used or tried to influence nationalism, Scottish nationalism, and tried to sort of pertain Free Kirk Presbyterianism as the only true religion of Scotland. So yeah.
I think we're running over time now, and I think I'm going to call things to a close there. And just to say, so I mean, Linda's got another comment that she's put in the Q&A. She says she talks about, you know, Anderson, the figure that Kirsty mentioned, advocating jihad and whether jihad is anti-cosmopolitan. So that I think there's clearly a discussion to be had. And Stefano's coming in now with Paul Bourget in Cosmopolis, talking about Catholicism as the most authentic form of cosmopolitanism as opposed to more materialistic understanding. There's clearly, we need another session, I think, we need, on cosmopolitan faiths in Scotland and elsewhere. But I think for this session, rather than go on for too much longer, because there's another session coming up at 5 o'clock, I'm going to draw things to a close there and draw by things to a close by thanking the three panelists. Thank you so much, Charlotte, Kirsty and Fraser. Thank you so much for some excellent talks and really interesting discussion around them. I'm hopeful that we'll find ways to continue them. But maybe this is a good point to mention that there's a discussion forum on the project website if anybody wants to carry on offline. But I'm going to call things to an end there with this session. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the panelists for joining us. There's a brief break now, and then we'll be back at 5 o'clock with a final Zoom session with our plenary speaker, David Finkelstein. So compulsory wave goodbye. Thank you so much. Thank you.